Welcome to Cultimatum, a podcast dedicated to bringing awareness to cults and human trafficking. My name is Anonymous Andrew, and I'm here with my co-host Melody.
Hello everyone. As a cult survivor myself, having escaped from a cult called the House of Yahweh, I understand the major impact that these experiences can have on survivors. Our mission with this podcast is to shed light on these issues and provide a platform for survivors to share their stories.
Each week we bring you compelling interviews with survivors of cults and human trafficking. These brave individuals share their personal journeys, the challenges they face, and their paths to recovery.
Tune in every week to new episodes, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite platforms.
Thank you for listening to Cultimatum. We look forward to having you with us.
Stay safe, stay informed, and remember, you are not alone.
Hi there, welcome to Not Your Average Goat. I'm your host, Teisha Gillespie, and this is a show that celebrates all the shapes, sizes, and colors of diversity as well as adversity. Through authentic conversations, we hope to have an impact on dismantling societal stigma while creating a place for relatable storytelling. I'm really excited to talk to you, and I kind of feel like I know you a little bit, which might sound a little weird. From listening to your own podcast, Horf, which is where I originally came across you. And I don't remember exactly where I saw this. It might have been Threads, but you had done an interview with a person who recently put out a documentary called Everybody Dance, which follows a group of children managing autism as they're preparing for a ballet recital. And firstly, I just fell in love with the interview and just the way that you engage your guests and you ask questions. And I think his name is Dan, right? The guy who did the documentary. Yeah.
Dan Watt.
He's also so great. I followed him across like every single social media platform I have. But I fell in love with him too. And then I immediately went and watched the documentary and it was amazing. If you have not checked it out, I highly recommend it. I believe it's still on Prime and maybe on Apple TV too.
It's on Amazon Prime. It's on Apple TV. It's on a few other platforms too. If you check out Dan's social media presence, he's Dancing Dan W on Threads. I don't know and I think on Instagram as well. He lists everywhere that it's available.
So I'm curious to know, how did you actually become acquainted with Dan?
Threads.
Awesome.
Yep. He it was either Threads or Instagram. It was one of the two. So a Meta product, of course. He reached out to me and he was like, "Hey, I would love to be on your podcast to talk about my documentary." And normally I interview people who are themselves disabled or chronically ill or who are in like the specific demographic that I'm going for that episode. And he is, we talked about this in the episode as well. He is abled. He's able-bodied. He's a former dancer. Now he's a choreographer. And he made a documentary about disabled and autistic children at this inclusive dance studio in California. And at first I was a little hesitant because the Nothing About Us Without Us is such a significant part of disability activism. Mm-hmm. And I was a little hesitant to interview somebody where we would be talking about people instead of like where I would be talking to somebody who was like within the community. But I really appreciated the conversations we had back and forth through email discussing that very point. And the way that he did center a lot of the kids' voices themselves in the documentary. He let them tell their own story. And so I knew the conversation would be, positive and productive and non-objectifying of the autistic experience or the disabled experience, which is what I worry about when we, talk about issues.
Yeah.
And you interview disabled and disabled people and people with disabilities as well. And so you, I'm sure, have encountered in your own life too that how people who are not them, who are sighted or able-bodied often have misconceptions and there's stigma involved, and there's a lot of paternalism and condescension and misunderstanding about what our experiences are like, and there's a lot of objectification that happens in portrayals of us in the media or in conversations or in press. And so that was something I had been concerned about, but I was really glad that in the end that he reached out to me and we got to have that conversation for the podcast, because we did talk about framing. Ended up being a big part of the conversation was how we frame conversations about people when we are not part of the group.
And Dan, I'm so thankful to have advocates like him and anyone else who might be doing similar work. And I agree, it can be really challenging. I think oftentimes, yes, there are a lot of semi-intentional misconceptions. I think that a lot of disabilities and chronic illnesses, there's such a wide range. We talk about almost everything is on a spectrum. And so it can be really hard to understand the wide gambit of a disability. And I think that this is a great thing that you both talked about is if you know one autistic person, or if you know one deaf person, or one person experiencing chronic pain, you just know one person, because that person is not necessarily representative of the entire group, because everyone's experiences are very different. Some people experience kind of symptoms associated with their disability or their condition more severely than others. Kind of their emotional response to their disability also could be very varied as well. And so I appreciate kind of how objective the conversation was. And when it comes to the media, that's really tough too, because there are either non-realistic representations or misconstrued representations of folks with disabilities, or there are just no representation of those things at all. So it's either you don't get anything or you get something and it's very misconstrued. And that is something that I really hope one day we see that change. And I think it's really important that as whomever in the media industry tackles this, that they think about incorporating people with disabilities and people with chronic illnesses and other conditions in a very seamless, natural way. And it's not something, hey, we're going to do this show on autism. Let's bring in people who have autism. But hey, let's just do a show about normal life. And people with disabilities exist in normal life. Like, it doesn't necessarily need, I think it's needed to kind of highlight and bring more awareness to the conditions too. But I think it's also equally important to show that, there are people out there doing quote unquote normal things. And I think that there is a misconception that, people with disabilities and chronic conditions can't always exist in quote unquote normal society.
What I see tends to happen is people's responses to us and their depictions of us. And by us, I mean the disabled or just people with disability community writ large, tends to fall into one of two camps, is like either they pity us and we're seen as pitiable, or we're expected to be superhuman and like inspiration porn. Mm-hmm. And it's like, no, most of us fall somewhere in between those two things. We're just folks who need some accommodations to be able to get what we need and to do what we need to do, and we're tired. And it's because we have to keep correcting and advocating. But like, we're not superhuman, we're not super inspiring, but we're also not like cute little puppies with no agency who are like, oh, you poor little thing.
Yeah.
Like those seem to me to be the two ends of the false binary that people put us on. But like you said, we just need people with disabilities to be portrayed as like, it's not like this is a show about a disability. It's like, oh, this is a show and there are disabled characters because we just happen to exist everywhere.
Yes, exactly. Hopefully someone listening will hear that.
Yeah. Up to 25% of the population is disabled at any time, and it's the only demographic that you can instantly join that you weren't part of before. So
Yeah.
it seems like important to like know that if you're creating media.
Yeah, and I think, the thing about that statistic too is that's only self-reported. It's probably even higher than that. And I think that one thing that gets overlooked, I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit, are non-visible
Right.
disabilities.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's close. That's a little bit higher, I think, than the population with physical disabilities. Well, Elle, one thing I love to do on the show is to kind of like go back in time because I've always found it so interesting to look back to see what folks were like as young children and kind of just tracking that to where you are today. So if you remember like 7, 8-year-old Elle, who was she? What was your personality like? What were your interests? And do you see any similarities between young self and your current self?
Um, the short answer is yes. The long answer, the medium answer is I was a weird kid and I'm a weird adult.
I
Um,
love that.
yeah. And the longer answer is I can go back even a little further than 7 to 9. My first memory, like I'm gonna answer the question in my own way. My earliest memory is when I was 2. And it's just like this little flash of memory. And I know how old I was because my mom was pregnant with my sister in the memory. And I'm 2 years older than her. So, but she was like very pregnant. So like it was like right before my sister was born. Um, and then I have some other early memories from around like 3 or 4. Um, like the time I fell and like hit my face really hard and needed emergency dental work. I was like 3 and a half when that happened. So like I have some really early memories, but like not long ones. They're just like those core memories that sort of
Mhm.
stick with you and are just like little flashes of like I remember when that happened. Um, but I was hyperverbal and hyperlexic as a youngin. So by the time I was 7 to 9, um, my reading level was like way beyond people my age, and I was reading things that I shouldn't have been reading. Like
Oh
not
no.
naughty things, not naughty things, but things like Reader's Digest
Got
and
it.
my mom's women's magazines. And so I was already very anxious at that age. And so then adding like my brain invented all kinds of things to make me anxious. I was constantly worried I was going to die in like weird exotic ways. So like not in a like obsessed with death dark kind of way, but more like a oh my God, what if Africanized honeybees invade North Dakota and then I die by killer bees? Because I saw a show on PBS about Africanized honeybees.
Oh,
Like I would just take things that I had read or seen on TV and like my brain would just go to the nth degree with them. I remember being like 8 or 9 and reading a story about botulism in Reader's Digest. Again, most 8-year-olds not reading this stuff. And then I was so paranoid about food poisoning. I remember reading a story about hantavirus. Um, and I knew we had like some mice in our basement every once in a while. And so then I was convinced my whole family was gonna die from hantavirus.
oh no.
Right? Like, but I didn't tell anybody. Like all of these worries I held inside me and I didn't tell anybody about them. So I was just this really high-strung, anxious child who was just weird.
I ironically just had a conversation with another guest earlier this week, and part of her story is around anxiety as well. And when you were talking about the killer African bees, it made me it reminded me of a conversation I had with her. So a lot of her anxiety stemmed from a fear of contracting like a horrible health disease too and dying. And she talked about kind of like a defining moment for her was the story of Ryan White, and I don't know if you remember who he
I
was, but
I
he
do.
contracted,
Yeah. He had
yeah,
HIV. Yep.
yeah, I think he contracted it through like a blood transfusion or
Yep.
something.
He had hemophilia, I believe, and he got it through a blood transfusion.
Yeah. So she was talking about how she read that story. I think she was in middle school during the time that I think the story first came out. He hadn't yet passed away, and she developed this huge fear. She was like, well, if he can contract HIV, then I can, and I can also die. And then it became other things as well. And similarly, she never told anyone. It wasn't until years later where she was having a conversation with an old schoolmate, and her schoolmate was like, hey, do you remember that class where we had to read that story on Ryan White? And she was like, you have no idea how much I remember that story.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have since been diagnosed with ADHD, and my brain makes these leaps where like it connects things that aren't connected, which is great for creative practice. Like my art collections, I put together things that don't go together to sort of create something new. But it definitely contributed to that childhood anxiety because just one more example of the things that I was scared of. Some of them didn't even exist. I had seen, a special on what was it? Termites and then fire ants. Like I watched a lot of educational programming, and my brain, for whatever reason, combined the two into flesh-eating termites. And like, there's no such thing, but like, I had this fear of like bugs that would pick my skeleton clean, like piranhas, but they were bugs.
Oh
And
my
like, there's no
goodness.
such thing. But like, I became really scared of ants for a while, which was just like totally, it just didn't make any sense at all. But it did in my head because my brain had like smashed all these things together into some super bug.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, my brain is a weird place to live.
You could try selling that to Stephen King maybe for his next book.
I could, or I could just keep it to myself.
You could, because that might perpetuate.
I also remember, like, as far as like things to connect from my childhood to like who I am as an adult, I had really severe growing pains, like the kind where I would wake up crying and screaming in the middle of the night because my legs hurt so bad.
Mhm.
And so my mom would come in and she'd like rub my legs and give me children's Tylenol. And I just remember like the growth plates in my tibias hurt when I was little, and they hurt when I hit a growth spurt in middle school. And of course, being the high strung, anxious child I was in middle school, I was like, oh my God, it's bone cancer.
Oh
No,
no.
no, I just grew like 5 inches in a year. So like that's really painful. I tried to talk positively about my family as much as I can on my podcast, but I
Mhm.
have a very challenging relationship with my mother, and that's usually about as far as I go with it. I have been through 12 step. I have been through lots of therapy. There is some generational trauma on my mom's side of the family. And when basically when they say, it's kind of a warning sign when kids have persistent night terrors and nightmares, and I'm 39 years old and I still have nightmares. Like there's some trauma that happened. It was all kind of emotional stuff. That it's hard to pinpoint. It was just sort of all three of us kids dealt with night terrors and nightmares, and my mom did the best she could, but she was kind of emotionally unavailable for us.
Yeah.
And so like, yes, I had a happy childhood, but there was sort of like this weird disconnect between like what we could have had or should have had and what we got.
Mhm.
My relationship with my dad is really good, but he was also farming full time. We had a dairy farm and we had small grain crops. And so he just wasn't around as much. And my mom was the primary caregiver. Um, and she will not say that she was abused as a child, but and I don't think any of her sisters would say that either. But knowing what I know about my grandmother and knowing what I know about how my grandmother was raised, my grandmother was definitely abused as a child. And I mean, my grandma did the best she could, but it wasn't very good, you know. And so my mom and her sisters all did the best they could too. But we're all a little damaged.
Yeah,
So yes, me at that age was happy, but also, like I said, high strung, very anxious, lots of nightmares, very vivid imagination, obviously, because I thought I was gonna die from bee stings, and other random things that I read about. And then I was like really creative. So I started doing theater when I was like 9 or 10. I started sewing when I was 7. Um, so all of that creative stuff, like I'm a painter now, but I didn't really paint until I was an adult. So all the groundwork for like who I am now was definitely in place by that time. I used to read the encyclopedia for fun. Like I was just a weird kid. You know, like when people say I had early in my podcast, like episode 4, I interviewed a friend of mine and how I was like, did people tell you you were an old soul? And she said, yeah, all the time. And I was like, yeah, I think that's code for like weird kid and people just don't know how to like say it kindly. And so they're like, oh, that child's an old soul. That was me. I was a weird kid. I was just a weird kid. But like I'm okay with that because like at the time I was kind of self-conscious about it. Like once I realized that I was weird, I was like, oh no, I'm weird. But now I'm like, heck yeah, I'm not boring, thank God.
Yeah, I'm here for Club Weird. I love it. You know, what you were alluding to about your mother. Unfortunately, there's probably a lot of similarities, maybe not exactly the same between maybe what you experienced and what my sisters and I experienced. I was mostly raised by a single mother. My biological father and my mom got divorced when I was about 9 or 10, but my dad had really never been in the picture anyway. He was always working, and when he wasn't working, he was golfing or out with his friends or doing whatever. And then my mom was remarried for a couple of years later during my teens, but there was a lot of trauma, a lot of emotional trauma, a lot of physical trauma. I know that my mom was abused as a child, and my grandmother dealt with alcoholism for a little bit. What's ironic is that the woman I knew as my grandmother, when she became my grandmother, was very, very different from the person my mom described. So I do give my grandma a lot of kudos for transforming. I know that can be really tough. Unfortunately, I still have yet to see my mom kind of go through that transformation. And I was actually listening to one of your episodes, I think with Christy, a couple of weeks ago, and I had never ever heard the term mother wound before.
Mm-hmm.
And that it just resonated with me so much because I love that she talked about how even if you don't currently have a relationship with your mother, which I do not, I actually completely cut off my mother after my youngest sister turned 18. And I would have done it much earlier, but my mother was the type of person who would have held my sisters against me, and not I wouldn't have been able to see them if I had, disturbed, like, rocked the boat at all. So in order to try to maintain a relationship with them until the youngest one turned 18, I held on to that relationship for a little bit. But I have not talked or seen my mom in 4 years. So I think 2019 or 2020 was the last time. And it's very intentional. It's for me, there was a lot of toxicity. Even as an adult, anytime I would interact with her, there was a lot of toxicity. I remember constantly being torn down as a child, like physically, like having my physical appearance judged, being accused of, doing certain things, constantly being yelled at. My mom is always like yelling, like screaming, yelling at someone, one of either me or my sisters or even my stepdad when they were married. There was just always a lot of turmoil, and my mom used like hitting and, whatever else she had at her disposal, belts, whips, etc., as a way to punish and to exert her authority. And so, there were many times where, and, I'm also the oldest. And so for me, I struggled so, so much because even though I was the oldest, for the longest time, there was really nothing I could do. And I felt very helpless in protecting myself. And I felt even more helpless and like I was letting my sisters down by not being able to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's the biggest thing. Like I actually think, and maybe this sounds really weird. Maybe it's not the case, but I actually think that if I had just been an only child and it was only me who experiences, there's a slim chance that I might be able to forgive my mom. But I think what's harder for me is not being able to let it go when it comes to my younger siblings, because a lot of like my one sister is 14 years younger than me. So she almost kind of felt like a child. And by that time, of course, I left home when she was 4. So I really wasn't around much like physically to protect her. But that was really hard. And as a child, I never knew when I was walking in the door from school, whether I was walking into an environment where my mother was going to greet me with a hug and maybe like a peanut butter sandwich, or if I was going to walk into a house and it was going to be dark and she was just going to start screaming at me for maybe my room being a mess, or for some comment that I made the day before, or for whatever I would chose to wear to school, or for not telling her goodbye in the morning. So it was a very, very unstable environment. And now that I know more about the condition today, my siblings and I believe that my mom is undiagnosed bipolar disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, mental health, I think one, just culture, just societally, 70s, 80s, mental health just wasn't something that was talked about. It just was a taboo topic. But then my mom is also and I think still identifies just very radical religious. She calls herself a Christian. That's her identification. I don't know if that's actually what most Christians would agree with. So I hope no one gets offended, but she didn't believe that mental health was a thing. And her philosophy was that you could pray on it and you could just make it go away. And if you had something like bipolar disorder, that it was Satan trying to destroy you. And so there was just really, my childhood, I think having my sisters there, having my grandma, I think there were definitely very happy moments, but I do go back and, even to this day, I grieve for what could have been, especially if my mom had been treated, because I do know people who have bipolar disorder who do manage it through some type of treatment, either behavioral or through medication. And they are really good parents. Mm-hmm. So I know it's possible. It could have been possible for me.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you grew up that way. That's hard.
Yeah, but I'm at a place now. I know that there's probably still damage and there is still that wound. My mother also doesn't really acknowledge abuse. I don't know if it's something that she does as like a form of gaslighting, or if she's actually blocked it out of her memory.
It's interesting how you said your mom doesn't really acknowledge any abuse. I've read a couple times how that's pretty common, or they don't even remember the events that were so formative to us. And it's because for us they were core memories, and for them it was just a Tuesday. Was like how I read it, how it was described. Like for them it was just a normal day, and for us we were developing. It was a core memory, and that's the big difference, which sucks.
You actually worked for a school for the deaf and the blind for a while, teaching mixed grades of students. Where did your kind of passion, or like what motivated you to go into teaching?
Well, apparently, when I was in kindergarten and my sister was 3, I would come home from school every day and try to teach my 3-year-old sister everything I had learned in kindergarten that day.
Aww.
I don't remember doing this, but my mom talks about it. So apparently I've always been a bit of a teacher, which I get that. Like I do love sharing information and facilitating learning experiences for people. As far as the working with deaf students. When I was in middle school, I had a camp counselor who was a speech pathology major in college, and she taught a group of students a song in sign language. And I was like, this is really cool. So I went to college for that, education of the deaf and hard of hearing and elementary education. And I knew I wanted, like going through the program, you learn about the different avenues for applying that degree. And I knew I wanted to work at a residential school. And so when I got a job at one out in Idaho, my then husband and I moved out there, and I'm divorced now. But I ended up teaching at that school for 13 years. I mean, I still go back for graduation. So the reason I left is because I became too ill to keep working. It was a combination of burnout and illness, kind of a negative feedback loop. So I still go back every year for graduation because I still have former students who are in the school who are, becoming seniors and graduating. So obviously the school meant a lot to me and my students meant a lot to me. So there's a lot that sticks out. The students came from all across the state. So it was a residential school specifically for deaf and blind students. I worked in the deaf and hard of hearing department, and just the small class sizes and the deaf staff working with students, and it's a positive environment for kids with hearing loss to be around other people like them and to not be isolated as the only deaf kid in a public school, which happens a lot, especially in rural states like Idaho, where a lot of the smaller schools have small populations and one deaf kid, if there is a deaf kid. I was able to get a couple artists in residence to come work with the students a couple times while I was there. One of them was a visual artist from Boise, Idaho, and one of his favorite artists was actually a deaf artist from Idaho named James Castle, who had attended the deaf school in the early 1900s. But at that time in the early 1900s, the school was an oral school. They didn't use sign language in the classrooms. And because James Castle never learned to speak, he didn't stay in the school system and he was sent home. But he was a self-taught artist who was quite prolific. He's become quite well known in the art world as like a self-taught sort of outsider artist. And our students, the artist that I worked with for the residency, his name's Troy Passy. His favorite artist is James Castle, and he'd always wanted to come visit the school. And I wanted my students to have an experience studying a deaf artist. And so we collaborated and did a week-long residency, and it was really, really powerful. That was with elementary kids. And then I was able to take one of my high school students a couple of years later on a tour of the James Castle house. She was really into art and had studied his work. And then the James Castle house provides interpreted tours because it is such a deaf-centric experience. They provide regular interpreted tours. And so just everything connected to the James Castle house and James Castle and the James Castle archive just really meant a lot to me and to the kids, and has actually really influenced my journey as an artist as well. And it's one of those things that, like, before I moved to Idaho, I had never heard of him. And now it's just like a thing that I want to tell a lot. Like, I want to talk about it all the time because he was so cool. I just had a conversation with my nephew about him the other day. I was like, oh, hey, have you ever heard of this guy?
Well, thank you for sharing, because I had never heard of James Castle either.
Yeah.
And I love that you go back every year. That's so sweet. And I'm sure the kids love it too.
Yeah, I'm going back in just a couple weeks, or in about 3 weeks, I'll be flying back for graduation. And then another thing that really sticks out is just the language flexibility of, I guess this kind of gets into something that you had mentioned when we were prepping, wanting to talk about misconceptions of or stereotypes of deaf or hard of hearing people. But like 30% of my caseload were kids from Spanish speaking families, either bilingual or ELL families. And just the language flexibility that some of those kids develop is really incredible, where they're juggling Spanish, English, and sign language. Because a lot of my students weren't necessarily like totally deaf. There is a whole continuum of hearing loss that is considered deaf and hard of hearing. And depending on the amplification that people use, hearing aids, cochlear implants provide various amounts of hearing back, but it's only a tool and it's imperfect and it provides, amplification but not clarity. There's all of these factors that play into like each person's hearing loss. And so a lot of my students did speak to a certain extent, but it was a lot of work for them. And someone's speech isn't necessarily an indicator of how much or how little hearing they have or how easy it is for them to use it. All of that to say, I was continually amazed by students whose communication skills surpassed what people expected of them. Their ability to like use multiple means of communication that weren't necessarily, quote, the targeted means. The students who used emojis to text their parents because their parents spoke Spanish and they were learning English in school, and that was the only way they could text their parents was to use emojis. Just how adaptable the brain is linguistically. Like that is just something that has always like amazed me and stuck out to me, is just how much humans desire and need to communicate with each other. Like we will figure it out.
As you were talking about how these kids were accomplishing way more than what others were expecting them to, especially the children who were juggling multiple different languages, it kind of reminded me, even though I know this person doesn't identify as deaf or hard of hearing, and I don't know if she has a disability at all, but it reminded me of that very popular scene from Modern Family. I don't know if you've watched it, but the one with Sofia Vergara where she's kind of going off and saying like, if you only knew how smart I was in Spanish.
Yes. Yep. I totally get that. Yep. I experienced the opposite of that. I did a Spanish immersion program out at Middlebury College.
No way.
Yeah.
So I used to work for a company called K-12, and Middlebury Interactive Language Academy was one of the things that I did marketing for.
Okay. I did one of their Spanish language programs, and at one point I was so frustrated and I was like, you guys, I'm really funny in English. I said it in Spanish, but I was like, you guys, I'm super funny in English. Like, I can't crack a joke in Spanish. I'm hilarious in English, but like in Spanish, like I'm not funny at all. Because like humor doesn't translate. It doesn't. It's every language has its own brand of humor, and I just hadn't figured out Spanish yet.
Welcome to the Dead Podcast. I'm your host, Desi, and on this podcast, I discuss all things spooky and weird, from ghosts, demons, religion, to folklore, urban legends, true crime, and all things paranormal, with some horror movie reviews sprinkled in. So join me on this spooky ride.
You manage a slew of different chronic illnesses, one of them being chronic migraine, and you shared that one of your first chronic migraine attacks happened in 2013, in which you experienced a migraine for 23 days. That's really intense. I could not imagine having had that my experience. And I know that, when it comes to chronic migraine and actually getting a diagnosis, you kind of had this journey. You had an experience with a syndrome, Alice in Wonderland syndrome, as a child, which you believe is connected to the underlying neurology for your migraines. And then you also had a misdiagnosis as a teenager, dysmenorrhea. Is that how you pronounce it?
Uh-huh.
That kind of ended up being changed to a diagnosis that gave you a lot of clarity about your chronic migraine. So I was wondering, can you kind of walk us through your journey to getting diagnosed and kind of that connection from childhood? I think it's so important to talk about this, especially when it relates to medical or healthcare issues that females experience, because sadly today there's just so much misdiagnosis or undiagnosis when it comes to females, and especially when you bring in like gynecological issues.
Oh yeah, medical misogyny is alive and well, unfortunately. I guess I'll start with that first migraine attack. 2013, I was going through a divorce, and we were sitting in the gymnasium. Not me and my husband, but me and my class were sitting in the gymnasium practicing for that year's Christmas program, and all of a sudden the lights flickered. And I looked at my parapro and I said, "Did you see that?" And he said, "See what?" I said, "The lights kind of went like," and I signed it, like they went wibbly is the word I would have used in English. The lights went like this. And he said, "No, I didn't see that." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And about a half an hour later, it felt like I got hit in the head with a frying pan. So what I thought was the lights flickering was actually an aura, which is what there's a type of migraine with aura, where you see like flashing lights or sparkles or other visual disturbances.
Mhm.
And then a bit after that, you get hit with the pain. That migraine attack lasted that's the one that lasted 23 days. Okay, going back, tying this back to me being like, who was young Elle when I was like 7 to 9 years old, I thought I was going to die. Partly because there is a hereditary stroke disorder that my mother has and my aunt has and that my grandmother died from. Partly because I was flying home for Christmas and I had a flight home and then a flight back. And I was like, my head hurts so bad and I'm going up in a pressurized cabin. My brain is going to explode. And partly because I had never been in that much pain in my life. And it was terrifying. And everything I tried to get the pain to stop failed. So I flew home for Christmas and I was miserable. And my parents paid for me to fly back to Idaho early to go to the doctor because they were really worried about me. And I got into urgent care. And the urgent care doctor gave me a printout on migraine and told me to go home and take Excedrin. I was like, I already tried that. Like, I gave you the list of everything I've tried already. And I felt really defeated. And so I went into my regular doctor and she said, "Oh, it's stress and anxiety because of your divorce. Here's some muscle relaxers." I was like, okay. So I took the course of muscle relaxers every night before bed for like 2 weeks. The migraine went away, but as soon as the muscle relaxers were gone, it came back. So I went back to my doctor and I'm like, I'm back and my head still hurts, or it hurts again. I said, "I'm really worried that this isn't just, quote, stress and anxiety. I think something's wrong with my head. Did you know that I have this history, this family history of this disorder? I think I need an MRI." And so it took me asking for an MRI to get one and for telling them that my family has this rare disorder. Because apparently having a headache for 23 days isn't like enough for people to worry that there might be something wrong with my brain. Like it still boggles my mind 11 years later that me saying my head has been hurting for 23 days, nothing makes it go away. And they're like, maybe no one thought to look. Like, it makes me so upset still that they weren't curious about it.
Yeah.
And that has happened so many times in the last 12 years, really most of my life, actually, but specifically the last 10 to 12 years, where like, they're like, we don't know. And that's the end of the story. So anyway, my doctor orders the MRI. We get the images back and she's like, "Oh, shit. I'm going to refer you to a neurologist. You might have MS." Like, I told you something was wrong. Like, I realize I'm neurotic and a little bit of a hypochondriac, and I'm always terrified of dying. But like, I only go to the doctor when I know something's wrong. So anyway, I get a referral to the neurologist and he's like, "It's not MS. You have chronic migraine. The damage to I do have white matter damage." He's like, "That's just because your migraines last too long." I'm like, "Oh, cool. Thanks." So I end up getting meds for migraines. And over the years, I've had to change my medication and that's been like a whole ordeal. But basically, I don't remember most of 2014 because it took so long to get them under control. Because the thing about migraine is that once you have a migraine, you are more susceptible to future migraine. And the more migraine attacks you have, the more you are likely to have. So it's sort of exponential. So like if somebody has never had a migraine, their risk of having a migraine is very low. But once you have one or two, your risk just keeps going up. It's like getting stuck in a rut with like your bike or a vehicle. Is that once that track is there, you're much more likely to fall into it. So that is part of the headache story, the migraine story. When in 2014, while I was driving home from Idaho to North Dakota to visit my family, I was listening to a book by audiobook by Oliver Sacks, the British neurologist, called Hallucinations. And there was a chapter on juvenile migraine or pediatric migraine. And he described Alice in Wonderland syndrome, which is basically, if you've seen or read Alice in Wonderland, the scene where she comes across the cookie and the little potion, the eat me, drink me.
Mm-hmm.
She gets really, really tiny and really, really big. It's like having that experience in your own body as a hallucination, but lucidly. So like it's all neurological. It's not psychological. You're not on drugs. Like you know that what you're feeling and experiencing is wrong. That like it's not possible for your body to be growing and shrinking and for your vision to be telling you what you're seeing. But the wires in your head are basically getting kind of crossed. I had to pull my car over and like have a minute because what he was describing as a symptom of pediatric migraine was something that I have experienced since I was about 6 years old. And again, I never told anybody about it because it was really freaky.
Yeah.
And it is associated with pediatric migraine, Epstein-Barr virus, and a couple other like high fever in children. Like they experience this. Most kids grow out of it. I didn't. I still occasionally get these Alice in Wonderland auras, and then within about a half an hour, I get a like hit with the pain of a migraine. It's really trippy, but it was one of those moments where I realized it wasn't just the stress and anxiety of my divorce that started my migraine problem. Like the neurology was probably there since I was little, if I was having the Alice in Wonderland without the headache as a little kid. So that was just sort of like this moment of like, oh, so my brain has always had this propensity toward misfiring, whatever that looks like. It's just I didn't get the pain until I was older. Starting when I was in 8th grade, I started passing out every month when I had my period, like severe abdominal pain. My blood pressure would bottom out. I'd pass out. I missed school. It was awful. They put me on birth control in high school, and that helped. But now that I have, chronic migraine, classic migraine, and the family history of stroke, I can't take estrogen anymore. So they have me on like the progesterone mini pill. But now that I like am more like in tune with what the phases of a migraine feel like, the prodrome, the aura, the attack, and the postdrome. And I have meds, like emergency meds, where like if I feel a migraine coming on, I can take one and stop it. A lot of my intense cramping and pain from my period is a menstrual migraine. So now I'm wondering, like, how long was I experiencing menstrual migraines that went undiagnosed? Because I'd go to the doctor and they're like, oh yeah, sometimes people just have really tough periods. Here's some birth control. And again, nobody was curious enough or persistent enough to go, wow, someone should not be passing out every month because they're in so much pain. And when I had laparoscopic surgery, because I was convinced I had endometriosis because I had all the symptoms, but there were no adhesions. They're like, oh, well, we found a couple cysts, but nothing that should give you the symptoms you're having. No one was curious enough to like keep asking questions. It's been a lot of like me asking the questions and just trying to tie everything together to figure out what's going on. It's kind of exhausting, and it's taken, years and years.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. And, I'm one person, right? It's like anecdata. I'm one person, I'm one plot point. But when you read studies or meta-analyses or whatever, it takes 7 to 10 years for women with chronic pain to get, or autoimmune disease to get the correct diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long time.
it's unacceptable.
Yeah.
It's total. During season 1 of the show, I interviewed a woman who talked about her journey to being diagnosed with PCOS and endometriosis.
Oof.
She had been told for like 10 years that she had everything else under the sun, including diabetes at one time.
Mm-hmm.
And, we were talking about this like medical misogyny, and for her, because her family, she grew up in a military family. So a lot of the doctors she had access to were male doctors. And so I think that I'm not saying that every male doctor is like this, but I just don't feel like the empathy is there sometimes. And also just, I think it's probably harder potentially for them to relate. But yeah, it's so prevalent. I'm glad that you were asking questions and demanding an MRI, because I think that is so important, especially if anyone has a condition or is experiencing pain, especially pain, and it's not going away. I agree that you have to push back and you have to ask the questions. And, I don't know when you got diagnosed with ADHD, Elle, but another woman I was talking to, and, not that this is kind of like in a different bucket, but it wasn't until her 30s where she got diagnosed with ADHD too. So no
I was
matter,
36. Yeah.
yeah. So like, no matter what the issue is, for some reason, we as women or as females are just, I don't know what it is. And I hate whatever it is, I hate it. And I would just wish it would stop.
I think something important to note about medical misogyny too is that like it's a system. It's not just the individual doctors. And so the first 2 doctors, the one who gave me the printout and told me to take some Excedrin, and the one from urgent care, and my doctor who just gave me the muscle relaxers, both of those doctors were women. So it's, yes, having a woman as a doctor can be a benefit in a lot of cases because, hopefully they are not as susceptible to medical misogyny, but they are educated in the same system.
That's true.
And it's the medical system is a misogynist system. My current gynecologist is a man, and he has actually helped me a lot managing my PMDD. He actually high-fived me last time I went in.
That's
because I have so few options for managing PMDD right now because estrogen is completely out of the question. So which means our options are like the mini pill and Prozac. Like that's basically what we can do right now. And he was like, he takes such good notes, and he always reviews my case before I come in, and like sort of like, so when I sit down, he's like, so last time you were here, this is what we did. Like, how are things going? And he takes really good notes, and like they're very thorough. And I was like, no, it's working. And he like gave me a high five, and he's like, good, because I don't know what else we'd do if that didn't work. And he pays attention and he listens and he doesn't interrupt. And I have had male doctors who are like big interrupters. I mean, there is something to be said about having female doctors, which is to help offset the medical misogyny. But I have also experienced the same dismissive attitude from women in the medical field because they are subject to the same education and the same bullshit as all the other doctors. They are confined by the same system.
Hi, my wonderful GOAT fans. Thank you so much again for tuning in. You all are truly the best. If you are enjoying this episode and all the incredible people and stories we showcase on this show, I'd like to ask you to consider supporting us in 2 other ways. 5-star ratings and reviews tell platforms like Spotify and Apple that you find this content valuable and that others may too, meaning they're more likely to show it to future listeners. Secondly, we are now on Patreon, and for just $3 a month, you can help me to continue to source incredible guests and independently produce this show. Visit patreon.com/NotYourAverageGoat to consider joining us today. Again, thank you so much for being one of our greatest of all time fans.
When it comes to, your other disabilities and conditions, a lot of them are invisible. We were kind of talking about this earlier. And when it comes to chronic pain, two conditions you manage are the undifferentiated connective tissue disease and fibromyalgia, which I do not know a ton about those diseases. I also imagine, just not knowing a lot about chronic pain personally, and I would wager a bunch of money that the average person doesn't know a ton about chronic pain and truly how that impacts a person. And there's probably a lot of misconceptions about it. So could you kind of walk us through, like, how do these two conditions or other conditions impact your day to day?
The first thing I tell people is that chronic really does mean all the time. Like, chronic means always. So even when I look like I'm having a good day, like, it just means that I'm at baseline, or that, like, I can ignore it for a little bit. But, like, I am probably in pain. I am in pain. It's just like background noise, like static, or like a TV on, like, the old school TVs, right? When you were in between channels and it was like staticky. Like, you can ignore it for a while, but if you had to listen to that all day, that would get pretty annoying, right? Like, you'd get overwhelmed with that static playing in the background all day. Eventually, you'd want to make it stop. And you'd try lots of different things to make that go away. But it doesn't. Sometimes the only thing to do to make it go away is sleep. And it doesn't go away. You're just not thinking about it. I think people don't understand there's a difference between pain and soreness and discomfort. But we also live in a society that sort of glorifies pain. It's virtuous to, like, push through pain. Like, workout shirts for women that say everything hurts and I'm dying. No pain, no gain, obviously, has been around for a long time. There was a commercial on TV last night for, like, BioFreeze or something, one of those topical analgesics. And it was like, push through the pain and keep on going, or whatever the slogan was. It was like, put this on your muscle, right, while you're intensely biking, and then just keep biking. Like, there's this idea that it's virtuous to push through pain. And it's not. Like, pain is morally neutral, right? Like, it isn't good and it isn't bad. And pushing through it is going to make you worse. Okay? Like, physically worse. Like, you're not going to enjoy it. It doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't, like, cleanse your soul. There's no reason to operationalize our pain. And I think that's something that I see a lot in our culture. It wasn't something I thought about when I didn't have chronic pain. And now that I have chronic pain and I see it everywhere, and I'm like, no, people, you should be resting. Like, there's no point to, like, push through pain, or to glorify pain, or to work out until you can't walk. Like, take care of your body. It's the only one you have. I think I have two more things about living with chronic pain that I can share that might help people who don't already experience it understand. One is that it is exhausting. Part of fibromyalgia is fatigue and brain fog. And I don't know if those are separate symptoms or if those are a result of hurting all the time, because being in pain is exhausting. If you were in pain all the time, it would take up part of your bandwidth and you wouldn't have as much brain power to think about other things. I recently read, and I don't know, like, if they've actually done a study on this or if someone was being quippy, so I can't cite a source, but someone was trying to, I think, make it relatable for people who don't experience this. But, like, living with chronic pain is like being 3 days sleep deprived all the time. So, like, even if I'm, quote, well rested, which I never feel rested, but even if I've had adequate hours of sleep, it's like I'm 3 days behind all the time. So imagine trying to do your basic everyday tasks after having 3 nights of really poor sleep. And that's just how my brain is all the time. Just sort of bleh, spacey. Because pain makes, like, chronic pain changes how your brain functions. The other thing I talk about is the medical field does not understand chronic pain. People who are in pain are treated poorly. The opioid crisis did not help that. And now it's even harder for people to get proper treatment for what they need. At school, when we were teaching, we would do Red Ribbon Week, which is like the drug awareness and prevention week. And the planners would always set up this like weird little graveyard of celebrities who died of drug overdoses, right? To try and scare the kids away from doing drugs. And they would put Prince in this little graveyard. And every year I would get on my little soapbox and I would say, Prince was not a drug addict. Yes, he died of an overdose, but he was not an addict. And I would explain to them that he needed a hip replacement surgery. From all of his years of rocking out, his hip had no cartilage left. He had severe arthritis in his hip. And it was bone on bone. That is painful. That is so painful. Prince was a Jehovah's Witness. Jehovah's Witnesses can't take blood transfusions. When you get a joint replacement, you have to sign off on blood transfusions. So Prince never got a hip replacement and instead depended on pharmaceutical intervention to manage his pain. There is a difference between being dependent and being addicted to painkillers. Prince was dependent on painkillers to manage his pain. He was not an addict. He was not addicted. Even if he was, there should not be the stigma there is around addiction. We should not be criminalizing addicts the way we do. And in a period where he was in excruciating pain, he took too many and he died. I have been in the position with my migraines where I have not remembered whether or not I took my meds or not. I have periods where I have been at the pharmacy waiting for my meds to be filled and I bought something and the next day I didn't remember buying it. I did not like to be alone during that 2014 timeframe when my pain was at its worst, not because I was worried that I would intentionally harm myself, but because I was worried I would accidentally, inadvertently do something to make the pain stop that would be harmful to myself, either by accidentally taking meds twice or by just like desperately taking something just to make it go away. And that's a scary place to be in.
It sounds so scary. I'm sorry, Elle.
And so that I think is what I think people don't understand about chronic pain. Like my pain is not that bad. I mean, it's not that bad. No, it sucks, but it's not as bad as it was 10 years ago. It's just different. I have treatment for it now. I can manage it. I'm still exhausted as hell. I can't work for more than 2 or 3 hours at a time, but I'm not scared anymore. Like that's the big change. I don't try to push through it anymore because I know that makes me worse. But I think that's what people don't understand is like showering is a chore. Getting out of bed is probably like I have to convince myself to actually get up in the morning. Not because I don't like my life, not because I don't want to do things, but because waking up, like the morning is like when I feel the worst because I haven't taken my meds yet. So I have to like convince myself that getting out of bed and hydrating and taking some meds is going to make me feel better and that it's something I want to go do rather than just lay in bed all day.
As you illustrated, I think, the stigma around chronic pain and then also the stigma around addiction, there's a lot of connection there. And I appreciate you sharing the story about Prince because I actually did not know his whole story. And I think that's such a great example of someone trying to self-medicate and treat themselves just so that they can exist and experience joy throughout the day.
Right.
It's not, and there is, I know that there is kind of like that actual chemical dependency that happens too. But I also, I recognize that probably in every case, someone is likely trying to escape some kind of physical or emotional pain, and that's the only way they know how to treat it, or the only thing they have access to treat it.
Right. And in a culture and a society where we feel so isolated and cut off, and we know that one of the biggest protectant factors against addiction is to be socially embedded and to have a strong support network. Like, what else are we going to do to self-medicate?
And, you know, going back to something you mentioned earlier too, it's not just the societal stigma, but it's also what the societal stigma is doing to our Medicare system and the availability of medicine.
Yeah.
Making it, and I'm sure there's probably money driving some of this too, but also like making it illegal or limiting access to certain medications because, oh, you think if someone doesn't actually need this, they're just addicted and they just want it for sport or something like that. And that's not the case. And I'm seeing that trickle down to other types of prescriptions and medications too. Like thinking of something, I don't want to say so simple, but so different from what we've been talking about. But for nearly 6 months, my partner was unable to get access to Adderall to manage his ADHD.
Yep. Almost everyone I know who's on Adderall or something similar couldn't get their meds. Yep.
He finally, because he was having trouble getting someone to prescribe medicine to him, we just, you know, coughed up the money. And I know it's so expensive for some people, and depending on your health insurance, to just do the diagnostic testing, which is like this 3-hour long procedure, or not procedure, but like this exam that you go and you do. It's like 3 to 5 hours. And it can be anywhere from like $2,000 to $6,000.
Yeah, it's intense.
It's so intense. But we finally just, you know, kind of coughed that up, and it's been helpful. But I recognize that not everyone has access to that money. I mean, we put it off for so long because it was so expensive.
It really is.
Yeah. I love for you to kind of talk a little bit more about HORF. You know, that's the podcast that you host. That's how I originally got connected to you. So can you just talk a little bit about why you started it and what listeners could expect by tuning in?
Yeah. So the name of my podcast is HORF, Radical Care in a Late Capitalist Hexscape. And originally I wanted to do a podcast about my experiences in caregiving. But then I realized that I was going to run into a consent issue because I really try not to share about any of my mom's stuff without her consent first. And I realized there's no way to do a twice a month podcast and have enough content without violating my mom's consent. And I wasn't going to do that. And I can't share my experiences in depth without venturing into, well, my mom, this is what's going on with my mom, and this is my response to it. And it just didn't seem fair to her. Like I didn't want to like make content that objectified her. I knew there was like a kernel of something that I wanted to do, and I just wasn't sure what it was. And the more I thought about it, it just sort of morphed into this sort of really niche category of like creativity and care. I interview all kinds of people really, but it ends up just sort of being this nexus of creative practice, caregiving, care receiving, co-creating the world that we want while still living in the one that we have. And the name HORF comes, it's a sound my dog makes. I have a Australian cattle dog, and she's deaf, and she is like the coolest dog. She makes these funny noises, and I had the subtitle for my podcast at first, and I just had put HORF in there as like a placeholder, and I was like, no, I think I'm actually just going to call the podcast HORF.
I love it.
We're just getting to the end of season 2. And I like where we're headed. I've really enjoyed all the interviews we've done, and I already have like several people who've reached out or I've reached out to, starting to plan season 3, and it's just been a really rewarding experience, I think, for everybody who's been involved.
Well, I personally really enjoy it. And, there's been many episodes that have spoken directly to me. And so I really appreciate that and being able to actually relate to the people that you're bringing on in the stories that they're telling and the kind of like the collaborative conversations that you all are having.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Elle, the last question I ask everyone. So my show is called Not Your Average Goat, goat standing for greatest of all time. So I did kind of repurpose the commonly used sports metaphor for, people that like Abby Wambach or LeBron James, etc., who get crowned like these just amazing athletes. And everyone I bring on the show, I believe, is a goat in their own way. And I believe the rest of the world should know about them. And so what I like to ask is either who or what for you in your life has been your goat?
So I've often said on my podcast that I am a recovering perfectionist and a recovering people pleaser. And the farther I get on my journey of learning and advocacy and allyship and all of the things, the more I've learned that like perfectionism is a product of white supremacy. And it's one of the many tentacles, right? We've talked about medical misogyny quite a bit. My podcast, my very first episode, I talked about how I had started a master's degree and never finished it. And it was very much about intersectional issues in education. So I was combining studies in ethnicity or bilingual education and anti-racism and gender studies, but through the lens of deaf education. Because I was just trying to fill in the gaps that I was finding as I was teaching kids that my undergrad program hadn't covered. And so the podcast is kind of an extension of what I didn't finish in my master's degree. Because I'm interviewing people who are disabled, people who are chronically ill, people who do have care-based and community-based values embedded into their small businesses or solo businesses, things like that, or their artistic practice. And so like the further along I get in this journey, the more tentacles that I seem to find are really just colonialism and white supremacy and all the ways that I'm able to sort of notice how my privilege has got me to the point where I am, and the ways that my own targeted identities have intersected with that. And I used to want to be the smartest person in the room and the best at everything I did. And the further along I get, the more I'm trying to divest from that. So I used to want to be the greatest of all time at everything I did. I'll be honest. One of the reasons I don't play Scrabble anymore is because I found it threatening when I wasn't winning at Scrabble. I took it as a personal offense. It was not a good look on me. But now I really just want to have the greatest nap of all time. I'm totally content, and I'm working on not needing to be a perfectionist and the best and stuff, because it's not necessary. I really do like collaboration more than competition. I just have to convince the other part of my brain that is true also. I'm tired. I think the greatest nap of all time, or the greatest vegan mac and cheese. That's been a pursuit of mine for the last few years, is like making the best bowl of vegan mac and cheese, like just comfort. Like I'm still gonna keep working and improving my painting practice. Yes, I'm gonna keep doing the podcast and advocacy work and stuff, but like I don't have to be the best at it. It's fine. Sometimes good enough is good enough, but like I really want to have the greatest nap of all time.
I love that so much. And I know no one's ever going to give that answer.
Like I said, I was a weird kid and now I'm a weird adult.
I love it. I love it so much. Well, if you ever nail that vegan mac and cheese, I don't necessarily identify as vegan, but I would love to get the recipe for that.
I don't either. I just can't have cheese because of the migraines. And so I miss it because cheese is so comforting. And so I find all sorts of ways to incorporate vegan cheese into my diet.
Well, thank you so much, Elle. I really, really appreciate this conversation. And you are such a joy to talk to. I know you're like, I am one of the best people to be around when I'm awake. And I 100% agree.
Yeah, some of that's just tongue in cheek, but thank you.
Hey, I like the confidence. We need more of that around here. So,
well, thanks. I had a really great time talking to you too. Thank you for inviting me.
Not Your Average Goat is produced and edited by yours truly, with music by Sergey Quadrado and Anton Vlasov. All content is copyrighted and should not be recreated, reproduced, or reused without explicit consent. Please visit notyouraveragegoat.org/contact for questions.